Thank you for all being here, for coming, and I arranged myself here. And here are the arrows, and there's already a slide. And they asked me if they can, when I was going to start the PowerPoint presentation, and I said, you might as well start it now, because then I'll know what I'm talking about. So here it is, and now I know what I'm going to say. The first thing I want to say is, of course, is thank the Browns for inviting me here again, and say how sorry I am for the tragedy that the family has endured recently, and how happy I am also that the convention has continued, and there are an awful lot of people out here, and a lot of people who've had the good sense to stay away too, I notice. But today I want to talk about something that is not talked about a whole lot, and basically it has to do with what do abductees do when they're not being abducted, which is kind of an odd way of putting things. It has to do with people who are aware abductees. Now, I'm not going to be talking about people who are unaware and sort of are maybe floating around a little bit trying to come to terms with what's going on with them and searching for answers and all that. These are people who I have worked with and who pretty much know what has happened to them and certain kind of problems then are presented to them. And the first thing I want to talk about is something that people have sort of gone back and forth about. In fact, I attended an abductee group last night that was presided over by Yvonne Smith, and managed to force my way onto them. And they were talking about the trauma sometimes involved with this phenomenon. And one thing that you have to understand in terms of traumatic experiences and how traumatic this is that the abduction phenomenon begins in infancy and goes to old age. So when somebody comes to me and they say, I was first abducted at the age of 22, I automatically know, well, that's probably the first one that they partially remember as being an actual abduction event, but they probably had a whole bunch before then. And in fact, that has turned out to be true in virtually every case, that I've been able to look at. Sometimes I only see a person once, and so I can't tell what that person. But in every person I've had a long sort of experience with in terms of examining them, that has been true. And therefore, the events have happened many, many times. Let's just say a person is 40 years old, and they come to me, or 50 years old, or something like that. They come to me for the first time, and they say, I think things have been happening to me. I remember something when I was, 12, and then 28, and then something happened to me when I was 42, and so forth. Well, when we begin to look into it, you begin to realize that these events happen with tremendous rapidity and frequency. People are abducted quite a lot of times, and they don't know it. They are abducted. The lowest amount of abductions I've ever measured in a person I was working with was something like, I can't remember, it was like 9 or 11 abductions in a year. And that was the lowest number I've ever seen. So the question then is, when you begin to do abduction event hypnosis, and you're dealing with a person who might have had, let's just say, 10 abduction events for 40 years, you see, suddenly you're dealing with 400, and that's the lowest. So let's just say we'll be real conservative, and you're only dealing with 200 abduction events in a person's life, or even 100. The question then is there going to be the same amount of trauma every single time? Because they're used to it from the time that they were born, and the reason we know that they're used to it from the time that they were born, or at least had it from the time they were born, is because parents are abducted with their babies and with small children. So the question then is, how much trauma is there? And I found that, first of all, if it were to happen to me once or twice, it would scare the hell out of me, obviously. I would be traumatized for life, there's no doubt about that. But there is a certain aspect of this that is part of people's lives, and they kind of know what is going on, and they know the drill, so to speak. And I found that it is the act of remembering for the first time that is really the most frightening thing that they can do. Because the second time I do a session with them, it's a little less frightening, but it is frightening. The 30th time I do a session with them, it's not frightening at all. They just know what's going on. And so that sense of overwhelming trauma really doesn't exist for them. This is not to say that they're not scared or fearful, that is true. But these are traumatic events in large part through recall of them, and that can be overcome, actually. So I'm not going to be talking about the trauma so much involved with it. I'm going to be talking about what happens to them in their normal lifespan, in their normal lifetime. Because these abductions obviously have enormous and important effect on their lives. One of the greatest effects, of course, is just simply knowing that it's going on, and knowing that you're a person who has a different life that you lead, in essence. One that is happening even unbeknownst to you in an odd way. That there's a tremendous amount of time that you spent not knowing what is happening, and not even being aware of. That is a very odd concept to sort of grasp for people. It's something that is inconceivable almost, unless, of course, you have some sort of multiple personality disorder or something like that, and you're not aware, although most alters are aware of other alters, but it's a complicated business, and it's just not a normal situation. So the first thing that happens to them, of course, is this kind of what John Mack used to call ontological shock. That is to say, the shock of knowledge. And this sort of idea that, oh my God, this is actually happening to me. And the first thing that you also notice with them is that they have certain fears that go along with this that they've never been able to explain. They might be frightened, for example, of a certain stretch of road. For example, in this particular slide, you can see that a person would be traveling down a road, and suddenly there's an object parked, so to speak, waiting for him or her. As the car stops, they're let out and into this object or whatever. This is an event that happened to a woman, and she was trying to describe to me how large this object was, how it fit past the 2 lanes of the highway and went off into a sort of a berm on either side. And then, for some reason or other, they forget this. Well, not for some reason or other, but they forget what happened, and then all they know is they're afraid of that place now. They don't want to go down that road anymore. That road is a road that they want to avoid. I've had people tell me how they'll travel miles around so that they don't have to go down this particular road. And I found that to be very, very common. And of course, there's something that I call the funnel effect, where people are frightened that it's going to happen to them at any time. It's not just fear of a place, it's fear of, let's just say, going to sleep at night. Because a minimum of 40% of all the abductions that I've looked at happen at night when people are sleeping. Maybe the other 60% happen some at night when they're not asleep, they're watching television, a lot during the day, and so forth. So the first thing that happens is they think, uh-oh, I hear a noise. There's a noise. It's them. They're coming. They're going to come after me. And I got to get ready now. And then I'm not going to go to sleep. And I'm going to sit up here and I'm going to wait. And I'm going to catch them. And then they sit up all night long and it doesn't happen. but it's like they funnel almost anything unusual into the phenomenon. So they will think to themselves, well, now I know why I am frightened of, well, now I know why I like strawberry ice cream, or now I know why I put my pants on one leg at a time, or whatever it is. They funnel everything into the abduction phenomenon, and it starts to take over their lives. And I warn people, don't do that. If you hear noises at night, it's just burglars. Go back to sleep. It's all right. A lot of them sleep with protection. You know, they have guns under their pillows and knives and all the rest of this stuff. They can't sleep at all at night, or they sleep. They only go to sleep when the sun comes up, and even then they sleep with the radio on. They sleep with the television on. They sleep with lights on if they do at night, and on and on and on. And it just, the whole thing can be very, very, very upsetting for their normal lives. Well, this fear of places, though, is actually an important one, and many, many, many abductees have it. They're afraid of their backyard. They're afraid of their basement. They're afraid of some odd room in their house. They don't want to go into the dining room or whatever. That's something they would never do. And you get this whole sort of range of fears. Now, one of the most important things that happens is coming back, and I know that Bud Hopkins have talked about this quite a bit, and so have I, is coming back with unusual bruises and fear and marks on people's bodies and on all the rest of that stuff, and puzzling, like, how could this happen? How did this happen? I have a slide somewhere here. Here. This is just a straight puncture wound. This woman actually woke up with about 4 on her face and several on her arms, and this is just a close-up of a puncture wound on her arm. And here is a woman who has, I don't know if that's easy to see, but there's bruising on her arm, inside her arm and on the outside. Actually, it was all over her arm. And it was actually on both arms as well. And there's a lot of bruising on her legs. And normally, if you're sleeping alone at night in your bed, in your feather bed, you're not going to get all bruised up. You're not going to wake up unless, of course, you've had abduction experiences where this is extremely common. Extremely common. Well, this can be taken actually into different areas. For example, one time a person came to my abduction group, and she had a broken wrist. Broken wrist. I said, well, how did that happen? You know, how'd you get? And her answer was, I don't know. Well, that's not an answer a 40-year-old person gives. You don't, if you were to break your wrist, you tend to remember what happened that would cause that. You know, it might stick in your mind. And she said she just sort of woke up with it, and it hurt like hell, and so she had to go to the doctor, and there was a broken bone. And of course, that's not possible, because once again, when you're asleep at night, you don't break your bones normally. I mean, at least it hasn't happened to me in a long time. But so we did a session on that, and one of the things they did with her was these are hybrids now, and I'm going to be talking in large part about hybrids, but that is to say a mixture of human and alien, and a lot of people have been talking about this recently, and of course it was discovered by Bud Hopkins back in the early 80s, and it's a central feature of the abduction phenomenon. But basically, they got angry at her for some reason or another, primarily because she had been talking to me, and they did not want her to do that. And one of the things they do, and I've noticed in terms of trying to keep abductees what they call in compliance, is they have a certain modus operandi. There's a certain way in which they go about physically punishing people because they understand that physical punishment scares people to death. So they would push people down, push you down on the floor, and then pick up women, for example, by their hair. And they do other things as well. Well, they pushed her down. She fell back, and she put her arms out to break her fall, broke her wrist. It wasn't an intentional thing to break her wrist, but she woke up in the morning with a broken wrist. And that's sort of something that you just kind of have to live with. The idea of you've got a broken bone and you don't know how it came about, and it's probably best that they would say to each other, it's probably best not to think about how I got this. That would be the best thing to do. I won't question the fact that I have a broken bone in my body. I'll just get it fixed and that's it. One time I had a person who was with a group of hybrids, and she broke away. That's a long story, and you'll just have to sort of go along with this for a second. But this was years ago. She was in a car, and she managed to open the car door and run, and they were actually in a wooded area, and she fell. It was at night. She fell into a kind of ravine, broke her ankle. So in essence, she woke up the next morning with a broken ankle. Both these were at night. I have another story of a woman who presented herself with broken enamel from her tooth. She had a long split, and I have a slide of it here, which I'll show you in a second. And we could not imagine how something like that could have ever happened. This is something that's just so odd, so strange. How do you break your tooth, of all things, during an abduction event? Well, we did a session on it, and it was one of those things where you just wouldn't it was unexpected. She was on board an object. She realized that she had more sort of consciousness than she normally has, and she realized that she had more physical abilities than she normally has, and she realized that this gray guy who was standing in front of her probably deserved a really hard kick in the shins. So she kicked him and turned around to run, but there was a low-hanging wall right behind her, which she didn't realize. So she turned around and just whacked her face on the wall and chipped her tooth. So once again, it wasn't something that they had actually done to her, but she did in fact wind up with a chipped tooth. I have a picture of it somewhere here. There it is right there. And it was extremely embarrassing for her, extremely embarrassing for her. I had to get her to open her mouth to show me, because she well understood the fact that, oops, I'll just go to a zero here for a second, that people don't like to talk to people who have messed up teeth, broken teeth and all the rest of that, and so she didn't, it was difficult for her. It was very difficult for her, obviously, until she had it repaired. But the point is that these are sort of these physical things that people have to live with, and this affects their normal lives. There's all sorts of other problems like this too. Now, one of the problems for people who have a lot of abductions at night, and some people have most of their abductions during the day, and some people have most abductions during the night, but one of the problems is that in recent years, there has been a dramatic increase in the frequency of abductions for some abductees, more so than I have ever seen in my life. I've been doing hypnosis of abductees since 1986. I have never seen anything like it. And they would take people sometimes on a nightly basis. That meant that people were getting 2 hours of sleep a night, 3 hours of sleep. Well, if that happens long enough, you can get all sorts of problems. Physical problems can result from this. I don't know whether this is true or not, but a nurse told me that one of the things that happens is it can compromise your immune system, and that you just have your lack of sleep means that you can't regenerate your muscles, you can't regenerate your ability to stop diseases and so forth. And I have noticed that a lot of abductees complain about things like Epstein-Barr syndrome, which is a sort of chronic fatigue syndrome, and fibromyalgia, which is a problem, muscles, muscle pains and so forth. And this might in fact be related to lack of sleep. Lack of sleep also means you're tired all the time and in danger of falling asleep at the wheel when you're driving your kids home from school. Lack of sleep means that you're cranky a lot. You don't have that regenerative power, so you feel better in the morning and all that. It can be and has been a huge problem for people. And the question is, how do they explain the fact that they're tired all the time? And the answer is they don't. Because many people live in households that where they have no support. That it's very difficult for them to explain anything that's going on to their spouses. And the spouse thinks that they're nuts, And that leads to another sort of hidden problem of abductees. And the problem is, supposing you and your spouse want to get divorced. You've been married for a while and enough is enough. You've had it. And the spouse knows that you, male or female, you are an abductee. The first thing that spouse is going to do, and this has already happened a number of times, is immediately go to court, say she or he says that they're being abducted by aliens, having sex with aliens, I want the kids. This is a big problem. And the question then becomes, should the spouse ever say anything to the husband or the wife? And oftentimes they elect to say nothing. No, absolutely no. The husband, for example, doesn't have a need to know. And they don't. But then, whatever support the spouse can give is not there. So they can't rely on their husband or their wife to help them with this. All they can rely on is the fact that they're protecting themselves in the future in case anything untoward happens, and protecting the children and so forth. And this can be very, very difficult for people as well. Well, there are other odd things that you never would expect. Missing objects from the house. If there's a lot of abduction activity, oftentimes these beings, our special friends, as I call them, will take things. This one woman was telling me that she had this collection of comic books when she was a kid. And one day they were gone, and she blamed her brother. And she never got over it. She was always angry at her brother for years after that for stealing her comic books, although the comic books could not be found in the house. But she was certain her brother, who was this young kid, and she was young also, had done it. And she never got the comic books back. And we did a session once where these beings came into the house and took her comic books for various reasons. We've seen this before. Took a stack of books, and including her comic books. And she woke up and then they were gone, and that was that. For the next 20 years, it was lodged in her brain that her brother had done it. And then she said she's got to go to her brother and apologize now and say, this wasn't it. But it affected her family life. It doesn't seem like a big deal to us, but for her it was a big deal. Here's another one that comes out of the blue. Hair cutting. A woman will wake up and there's a lock of hair taken out, except that it is an enormous lie. It's a huge chunk. They have to go and get a haircut to match whatever was done to them, because it looks like somebody cut a huge chunk of the hair out of their head, which they did, of course. But the question is, before they're aware of abductees, is who could have done it? Well, the only person who could have done it was their brother or their sister. And once again, they blame their sibling, for doing this. And the sibling says, what are you talking about? I didn't cut your hair. I'm innocent, but they are the only people who could have done it. Therefore, they did do it, and therefore they are lying. And for a younger girl to have a large chunk of hair cut out of her hair, this is it's a big deal for anybody, obviously, and it affects their lives. It affects their relationships with their families and all that. And once again, it doesn't seem like much, but it causes fights and all sorts of other problems, and it can be a serious situation. Well, some people will have these experiences, and they just say to themselves, oh, this is just part of normal life. For example, one time I was in the outer office of the history department, and I was talking about the subject, and a student came up to me and said, oh, I didn't know you were interested in this. And I said, well, yeah, I got a passing interest in it, And she said, I said, why? Have you ever seen a UFO, or anything like that? And she said, oh yeah, lots of times. I said, well, come on into my office and we'll talk a little bit about it. Now, when a student comes into my office to talk about experiences or things that they've seen, I remain poker-faced throughout the whole thing. There's no way I'm ever going to say, oh, yeah, you're an abductee, you're one of them. I'm not gonna do that, obviously. I just listen and pass no judgment. But she told me the following story. She said when she was 6 years old, for some reason or another, she woke up in the middle of the night, she looked out, and she ran to the window and looked out the window. And out the window, and I'll give you an example of what this looks like, although this is not what happened, what she in fact saw as I go by these things here. Out the window, she could see people coming out of an object, and they were small and they were gray, although this is not it, but it's something like that. And just as she was looking at this, her mother came running into the room, burst into the room saying, hide, hide, they're going to get us, hide, hide. And that's the last thing she remembers. So I said to her, well, how do you reconcile this? I mean, what do you think this was? And she said, well, my mother explained to me at the time that this is just normal life. Everybody has these kinds of experiences. This is what goes on. This is what's part of being human. So she doesn't really think about it much because this is just what everybody has these things, I said, okay. I'm not going to say no, that doesn't happen to everybody, and I just, because I'm poker-faced. But she was able to incorporate this into her life and live with it as a normal kind of situation. And oftentimes there'll be a situation where people will see things in their house. And here's this being standing in the living room, and they'll in some way be able to reconcile this as just sort of another realm. There's like some other kind of alternative reality that sometimes intrudes on them but doesn't bother them. Here's another one in a bedroom situation where this woman is lying in bed. She drew this herself, of course, where these things happen, and all I remember is these little snippets, but it's okay. They're able to sort of get along with it. And yet, at the same time, they know that something is wrong, and they have this nagging feeling all the time, constantly, that something is off, something is different. When they then come to me and begin to examine these experiences, they realize that these things shouldn't be happening, that this is not sort of normal life and all that. Once they begin to realize what's going on, one of the things that happens is, of course, is that they become very frightened of other people finding out. Nobody should ever know this. This will make me look bad. I support this conclusion. I tell them, you have to be discreet. The main problem is the workplace. They go to work and they start telling their fellow workers, well, last night I was on Mars or something like that, then they're not going to have a job pretty soon. It's going to happen, particularly if they continue to talk about it. And once you mention that you've been abducted, people don't forget that. that will stick in people's minds for as long as you ever work at that place. It'll never go away. So I tell them you have to be discreet. And in fact, I do have cases of people who were let go because they just talked about this subject a little too much, and they were considered to be too odd by their other workers, and it just wasn't the place for them, and maybe they should seek their fortunes elsewhere. So they have to be very, very careful, and I emphasize the workplace. Telling their relatives might be a little safer. Telling their friends is iffy. If they tell their friends, the question is, how close are they to their friends? And will their friend really understand? And will they really have that friend very long? Once you say that you're abducted, you are immediately categorized as a lunatic, as a nutcase. So you can't tell fantasy from reality. And that puts a friendship on a whole different basis, you know what I mean? Because whoever is your friend has to deal with that. So they have to make the decision as to whether they want to do this or not. Whether they want to tell their friends that they've been abducted, or just let it slide. And my advice is make up their own minds. It's their lives, but letting it slide doesn't hurt anybody, and telling people can hurt you. So just be very, very, very careful.